This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 364, Cypress. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about Cypress with Jordan Graham. Jordan has been a Drupal developer for 11 years, starting in Drupal 5. He loves that he can work from anywhere, and so far in 2022, that includes Mexico, Spain, Michigan, and the Bay Area. And he's planning on going to Prague this month for DrupalCon. He's currently a senior developer for Ad and Design Group and a two-time Ironman triathlon finisher. Wow. I am a one-time triathlon watcher. A couple of friends do it. I watch them. That's about as close as I got. Well, Jordan, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Nick Laughlin. Today my co-hosts are, as usual, John is the solution architect with EPAM.
Hello, everyone. Jordan, just out of curiosity, could you tell everybody what's involved in an Ironman, like the short version, just because I don't think everybody might realize how amazing that is.
Well, it's a long day. So it starts with a 2.4 mile swim, so 3,700 meter swim, and then a 112 mile bike ride, and you finish that with a marathon. You run a marathon.
I would be dead. There's just no way.
I mean, the swimming and the biking sound great, but like the running, I just don't understand people that like to run.
It's a really fun day, and there are great crowds out that are encouraging, and you high five all the kids as you run by, and well supported races. It's a load of fun.
I have to say, I thought at some point in my life I would do that, but I'm a little more realistic now. That probably is not going to happen.
You're a young man.
I'll do 5K of each. That's a start.
Okay, and that other voice that you hear also joining us for the next 4 weeks as guest host is Tim Lennon. He's been part of the Drupal community for more than 16 years. He's currently the CTO of the Drupal Association, and he's been a frequent guest on this podcast. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Hey, thanks for having me, Nick. It's been good to be here again. Nice to sit in the host seat this time. Pretty cool. Actually, surprisingly, it's actually the same chair, but really good to be here. I think we just worked out. I've been on 10 episodes so far, so it was about time to do this hosting thing. It'll be fun.
There's an idea. We should ship everybody a chair.
Just embroider the Talking Drupal logo on the top. It'll be great.
Hey, my wife can embroider. She's got an embroidery machine. I should talk to her about that.
New merch for the podcast.
So we do have a new module of the week this week. It's a module that I discovered maybe a month ago. It's called Views Aggregator. I shouldn't say discovered a month ago. Maybe rediscovered. I'm sure I've used this in the past. But the Views Aggregator module gives you a new formatter, I think it is, in Views. It gives you the ability to aggregate, or it gives you the ability to perform a bunch of different functions on your Views results in a table. For example, you can aggregate rows. So if you have a view where multiple entities are referenced and you want to group them and sum them up and say, like, I have 10 of these things or 5 of these things, this module is perfect for that. You can also sum columns. So if you have say you have a quantity column and you want to just know what the total is at the bottom or something like that, then this will work. And this will work even if it's rendered output in some cases, or PHP in the back end that you have some sort of plugin outputting a different field. This works on non-database level entities for its output. So it's really powerful.
Programming note there, the module's namespace is views_aggregator, but the module name is actually Views Aggregator Plus. Isn't that correct?
I have no idea.
I think that's right.
I think you're right.
I am. Yes.
I think that was chosen because there's some built-in aggregation functions. So they were like, no, this is more.
Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah, so what this allows you to do, the aggregator module, I mean, the core aggregator functionality is fairly limited.
Yeah.
This gives you way more flexibility. Like you can group things by, by label, by type. I mean, it's really powerful. It is a performance. It can be a performance problem. If you have really complex queries or really complex relationships, this can really slow things down. But if you kind of just need to see some things in a pinch, it's a great module.
Awesome.
One of their examples is pretty cool. It does like a order statuses for like an e-commerce store, and then it totals up your total orders and then the total value of those orders, which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing it can do. Like if you want to see everything that's been completed today or shipped today or it needs to be shipped today, it can group those types of things. So you don't really, you just want to kind of get an overall bird's eye view of certain functionality. This is perfect for that. Okay, so moving on to our primary topic, we always start with some low-hanging fruit, an elevator pitch type question. Jordan, can you tell us what is Cypress and how it is used for testing?
Sure. So Cypress is a testing system that will test anything that runs in a browser, and it's open source and it's completely platform agnostic. So it doesn't matter if you have a React or other sort of JavaScripty framework providing your front end or a traditional Drupal theme. Anything that runs in a browser, you can test with Cypress. And it's used in a lot of different ways for testing. You can all the way out to as integrating with your continuous integration and deployment system to a much more plain vanilla running tests at your command line to make sure that your code does what you want it to do.
So it runs, sorry, you just said that anything that you can see in a browser, you can test with Cypress. So does Cypress need to run in a browser?
No, no, it doesn't. It recreates a browser experience, and it comes with a test runner. So once you install Cypress into your system, you can watch the testing experience happening in a Chromium browser. Actually, you get to choose between a couple of different browsers. So, but it does not require a browser in order to do its thing for you.
So let's back up a little bit here before we dive further into Cypress. And I think most of our listeners probably already know this, but for those who don't, can you explain why like this type of testing is important?
Sure, absolutely. So there are various reasons that people use testing in software development, not least being the client has asked you to deliver something that performs a certain sort of functionality, and you want to make sure that it does exactly that. So one of my earliest projects that I needed to incorporate testing was for a website that itself is a medical device. So in other words, it accepts an upload of some data, and it needs to analyze data and produce basically recommendations. And so it's clear that you needed to be producing the correct recommendations. So that's a good way of making sure that your software does what you want it to. Is you give it some data and you know what the results are supposed to be, and you can test, am I getting the results that I want? So making sure that it delivers the data that you're supposed to be producing, that's one great reason to use testing. And another is to guard against regression. So if you've got a project that you have some history with, and there's a new feature that is supposed to be developed, you want to make sure that all the features that you've built in the past continue to work in the way that they're supposed to. So this is the kind of thing that if you do test-based software development, those tests are going to be in your project, and you can add some new functionality and run your old tests, and that way you can be sure whether or not be sure that you haven't had any regression in your code. So in other words, everything that you've built in the past still works as you would expect it to work.
Huge time savings there for large code bases, right?
For sure. And speaking of time savings, that's another great reason to do test-based software development. Sometimes I'm tasked with building out a form that accomplishes certain things. And if I build my test while I'm building the form, I can have Cypress fill out the form for me as I go through the process of developing. So instead of me having to type in, the data in the form 30 or 40 times as I'm developing the software, because I'm developing my Cypress test simultaneously, I can have Cypress run all those, fill in all the data for all the forms. So that's another way that that testing-based software development can help save time.
Very cool. I mean, I think everyone who's tried to contribute to the Drupal project in the past is familiar with how much we rely on CI testing just in contributing to Drupal itself to make sure that contributions from thousands of different people don't introduce regressions. It's quite a lot to try and manage. It's clearly important. It's clearly valuable. I do know that different kinds of testing frameworks have different sort of scopes of capability, right? So, in our world, we have PHP unit tests. We might have Nightwatch JavaScript tests. We might have coding standards tests. Can you talk a little bit more about specifically what you can and can't test with Cypress?
Sure. So I've never thought about using Cypress for coding standards, but you can test anything that runs in a browser. So all of your JavaScripty front end sort of wizardry that happens can be tested with Cypress in a way that's really not that easy with PHP unit testing. So I've got a talk that I've delivered as a webinar again at Drupal Camp, Colorado, just this past summer, in which I used a case study of an Ajax-enabled form. So in other words, the response to one of the early questions changes the test a little farther down, changes the form, which is the kind of thing that happens sort of on the front end. And it's a lot more complicated to test for with PHP unit. Cypress is really ideally suited for testing like that.
Can it handle things like a refresh to check something? So for example, if you're adding a quantity to something by Ajax, and then you do a hard refresh to make or clear a cache or something, and then make sure that it's showing the correct quantity, is that something that Cypress can handle?
Exactly. And it's a very, to me, it feels like a very human experience. You can tell Cypress, once you add this value, look for this element that should contain your result. And then you can make an assertion that it should equal the desired result. And that's your assertion for your test. So it's very much like what our eyes would do: go find the component on the page that we're testing for and evaluate its value.
So I imagine there's like a value there for some accessibility testing, right? To be able to say like, hey, run this suite of like scenarios, checking for, alt text and stuff like that. I'm wondering, is Cypress able to kind of run as if it were a screen reader?
Yeah, as I haven't done that personally, but I've seen that there's a library that someone has put together for accessibility testing with Cypress. So
that's cool.
there's which sort of reminds me of one of the reasons I love Cypress is that it's got a really growing community. It was rated the #1 technology to adopt back in 2019 by, I think it's called Technology Radar. And since then, their growth pattern has only, continued in a positive way. So there's an increasing community of people that are developing tools for Cypress, and there's a lot of resources out there, including for testing accessibility.
Can you do visual regression testing?
I haven't used Cypress for visual regression testing, and so I don't know. I
would imagine you could with something that's sort of looking at these responses. You could presumably run, I don't know for sure. We'd have to check the documentations, but presumably you could run something that is just testing against fixed output without a user action first to see if anything has changed from your last set of test runs. That'd be cool.
So do you have a few kind of use cases where you're using Cypress, like in the wild that you can kind of share with us?
Sure. I think a great use case is permission-based testing.
Hmm.
So let's just suppose that there is some content that only users with say a member role should be able to see. Um, with Cypress, you can create custom commands for one thing that really Drupalize your Cypress testing. So, for example, you can define a custom command for Drush, and now that you have Drush in Cypress, you can create users on the fly. You can assign them roles. You can do all sorts of things with this, what feels like a very front-endy technology to me, Cypress, doing some very particularly Drupal back-endy kind of things. So in permission testing, you can first have Cypress try to access content as an unauthenticated user. You don't see the content because we're not a member. Create a user and don't give that user the member role. Try to access the content, and it should not be there because this authenticated user is not a member. You can add the member role, access the content, and then test that content should be there. So that's what I love about that as a use case is, first of all, it's really powerful to be able to generate users and add roles and permissions, with a minimal amount of code, basically because we're leveraging Drush. And then to be able to verify things like accessing content that should or should not be accessible by members with certain permissions and roles.
So I have two follow-up questions on that. And one you may have already answered, and I might have missed it, so I apologize for that. But Cypress can be run locally. So if I was using Lando or DDev or something like that, can I run Cypress on my local instance?
Absolutely, yes.
Cool. So I could set up a test and then just kind of run it and see how it fares before I commit my code. I'm sure my teammates would be happy about that. I don't know if you know this, but I was wondering how Cypress is different from something like Behat, because I'm hearing you describe Cypress and it sounds very familiar to Behat, but
I have not done testing with Behat.
okay.
Yeah.
That's fine.
I wonder, well, maybe you could describe a little bit, what is the actual, sort of syntax of a test? What does it look like if I'm a developer actually writing a Cypress test?
That's a great question. It looks at, first of all, it's very, it's a JavaScript based. So your syntax is going to look a whole lot like JavaScript. Cypress will allow, so Cypress has some native commands. You always precede a command with cy. So cy.visit would be, the Cypress command to visit, and then you pass that visit command a path that you'd like the Cypress to visit on the site. But when you look at some Cypress code, it's going to be most closely resemble, JavaScript. You're going to have loops. You're going to be able to define fixtures and so on, which we'll get into in just a little while. But yeah, so for people who are familiar with JavaScript, this is going to look really familiar.
Gotcha. Awesome. Which I think would make a lot of sense as we try and pull more JavaScript talent for decoupled Drupal and these kinds of installations, right? Giving people a tool that's in the same language that they're used to using to write their tests in, I think would make a lot of sense. And speaking of, as more decoupled front ends and JavaScript front ends get built in Drupal, can you talk about what drew you to Cypress for testing in Drupal, why it's good for the Drupal use case? I mean, you mentioned a second ago defining some of those custom commands, so that seems like a clear win, but other reasons that brought you here?
Well, I like Drupal Cypress for a Drupal developer for various reasons. I mentioned that it's an established technology with a growing community. What that means for me as a Drupal developer is that if I invest my time and energy learning how to work with Cypress, I'm not painting myself into a corner. This is a technology that's going to be around for a while. I can test anything that I need to test, or so far anyway, everything I've needed to test in the Drupal world using Cypress. I don't have to use Cypress for this and a different kind of testing for that. It's been able to test everything that I need to test. It's completely agnostic, as we were discussing about front-end framework. So it doesn't matter which project I'm on in terms of the front-end technology.
And not
Cypress
just
I can
JavaScript
use it.
either. It could also be PHP generated template front ends as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anything that runs in a browser. So, and I find that the Cypress's language itself is really intuitive. You can have an assertion that grabs a div by its ID and it should contain this text. You actually say should contain or does not contain or should. So
Right.
it's very intuitive language, and as you talked about just a moment ago, it's very easily extensible in ways that make a Drupal developer's life a lot easier.
Well, I think there's layers too of ease, because every new testing framework, that's their big selling point. Like, it's natural language. It's super easy to use, right? And I think progressively that's true. So I guess my question on that is, what's the time from I've heard of Cypress, I want to start using it, till I'm writing a useful test, right? Is it 1 day's worth of work? Is it a week's worth of work? Is it just a couple of hours before I'm actually writing? And I don't mean like really complex nitty gritty tests, but I'm also not talking about like, did this page load type test either. Like, what's the onboarding look like if I'm start looking to use Cypress for the first time?
So I'd say within a half a day, you can have Cypress installed locally in a project. Define things like your base URL and what's the drush command look like in your local setup. If I use Lando in my MacBook, it's Lando drush, right? So there's some things that you configure for your local setup, but within half a day, you should be running some meaningful tests using Cypress. It's not hard to get started.
Awesome. And you've said you ran a session just recently at Drupal Camp Colorado about this. So I suppose if listeners are interested in learning more, we can drop that in the show notes and they can take a look at the full presentation.
Absolutely.
Is there a Drupal module for Cypress that provides some helper things, or what does it do?
There really is, yeah. There's a Cypress module, and I haven't incorporated it into my projects, but what I like about the Cypress module is that it comes with some custom commands that are super useful. So I was talking a little earlier about defining drush as a Cypress command, and the Cypress module in Drupal.org is worth incorporating in your project, if only for that, if only to provide you with some of these really useful custom commands that a Drupal dev would want to use. It's also intended to be able to export some of your Cypress tests as configs, if I'm not mistaken. So that's it seems really useful as a way to get started with Cypress. I tend to learn the new technology, in and of itself, but the advantage of being able to use the custom commands that are defined in the Cypress module just from the get-go, that'll really dramatically increase your productivity in terms of like how quickly can I be creating new users using drush, for example. It's nice to not have to define all of that yourself.
So one thought I had, and this was kind of back when you were talking about submitting forms and being able to test forms like faster, right? Is how does Cypress necessarily do that? Is it submitting the form data? Or is Cypress kind of like a lot of other test frameworks where it's kind of setting up its own database or its own environment to be able to run the tests in order not to mess up kind of your pre-prod or your local database or anything like that?
Yeah, so I think that is an interesting difference between PHP unit testing and Cypress testing, is that it's at least in my use, I've never set up a test database just specifically for Cypress. With Cypress, when I, for example, create a user in the course of my testing, one of the first things that I'll do is I'll delete the user if it already exists, and at the end of my test, I'll delete the user again. So so I can use my existing database, I can use my existing forms. It does in fact submit the form. So the example that I used in my Drupal camp talk was a form that simulated the Bridge of Death from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So you've got I don't know if you know the scene, but
what is your favorite color?
Yes, there's 3 questions that you have to answer if you want to cross the bridge. What is your name? What is your quest? And then the third question varies basically. So what Cypress will do when you write your test is you say get the name field, and so you specify that by the ID of that element on the page, and then there's a Cypress command that's type. So type in your answer. So type in your name. And there are various ways to submit the form, like you click on the enter button. And so it actually submits your data. And it's the real legitimate user experience through whatever technology it is that you're testing.
So just to kind of close the loop on the question, right? So as somebody who's writing a test in Cypress, you have to kind of be cognizant of the fact that this is happening, and that you have to you basically have to clean up after yourself once the test is done running. Is that fair to say?
I think it's a good practice. Yeah.
And I suppose you could take it and deliberately choose. You might write your tests in your local or write your tests in your dev environment. But then if you're running them as regression tests, maybe run them in a staging environment, which is not the final version of your prod database, something that's overwritten back from prod, so you don't have to worry about it leaking up.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you probably don't want the actual Cypress test being deployed to production anyway, right? Like many things.
Wait, you don't test on prod? Oh, okay.
Sometimes it feels like it, I'm afraid. This says someone who's been getting some pager notices over the weekend. Anyway, so the other thing I'm curious about, and this is really relevant in the Drupal community, when we're running suites of tests for Drupal core and all this sort of thing, one of the things we're doing is we're constantly trying to optimize to get our test runs done faster. And that's sort of for 2 reasons. One, because it costs money. It's expensive to run ephemeral machines on AWS to be test runners. But also it's a productivity issue. If someone's been working on something and then they're running their test suite to get it fixed, right? If they have to wait an hour, their mind has wandered, they forgot where they were. And if there's a fix, they have to pick it all back up again. So, obviously it'll depend on what tests you've written and how many you've written, but roughly how fast is the sort of Cypress test framework?
Well, as I have written tests for permissions and for verifying output and so on, it can really rip through tests pretty quickly. And the fun thing about Cypress's test runner is that, as I mentioned earlier, you can watch a browser screen going through the tests, and then everything's being typed in and so on. When one thing that's slower is some drush commands. So I know that we probably all have typed in, drush CR, and then you have to wait several beats before drush is done with that. And Cypress has the same user experience using drush. Sure. So drush can slow things down a little bit. But it seems to rip through forms, and there's no there's no human beings involved, and so it runs as fast as it can. I can imagine that the more complicated your tests are, the longer that's going to take.
I wonder, is it possible to define the speed it runs at? Like if you wanted it to run at human speed? I'm just thinking about using it. This is a little bit obscure, but there are use cases where you are actually, you might have actually Drupal.org does some of this. We might have CAPTCHA triggers based on how quickly people are completing site actions. And so in some cases, we might want to see, what does it look like if it's an automated, if it's a bot that's blazing through, make sure it triggers those bad bot responses. And in other cases, we might want to be like, okay, we need to run this, but we don't want it to get caught. So we need it to look human.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, and autocomplete suggestions that you want to wait X number of milliseconds before returning a result. So that's the kind of thing that you would build into your test writing, is some JavaScript-based delays to simulate a human interaction with the form or whatever it is.
Can you run some of these tests in parallel?
Oh, I haven't, and I don't think that it's built for that. It's to my experience, Cypress has always run in a linear fashion through a defined set of tests. So no, I don't think it can be parallelized.
So one of my questions that always comes up, you mentioned that Cypress is open source, that there's a community around it. I'm always curious about the community, but I'm also curious about the ecosystem around it. Is there like a plugin or module ecosystem around Cypress for integrations or just for different features? You mentioned something about accessibility earlier.
Right. I have found an accessibility oriented library that someone, I think it was up on Bitbucket that I saw that. So the ecosystem is growing, and what I've seen is what's relevant to the Drupal community. I was a little surprised to see the Drupal module and Drupal.org, the Cypress module, but I'm really happy to see it because, as I said earlier, it provides some really useful custom commands right out of the box for Drupal devs. So there's as the community has been growing, there are more and more tools that are out there for us. How to integrate it, for example, into your continuous integration and deployment system, which is again something I haven't done yet, but I know that there are solutions out there that people have developed, and it's all open source.
Very cool.
So let's jump into some Cypress specific terms and things. I think you've already talked about the test runner. We talked about that early on in the show, but can we get into some more detail about like what the Cypress test runner is and how it works?
Sure. So when you use Cypress, there are two different sort of levels at which you need to install it. One, you install it. I'll just speak about using it in your local dev environment. So you install Cypress on your local machine, so globally, so that you can use it with any project. And then within a project itself, you also install Cypress like to your project, and you need to let Cypress know what the base URL is and what some other parameters are for this particular project in this particular local dev environment. And then, so once you have it installed globally and in your project, the Cypress test runner is the app itself that you have installed globally, and it's got a graphical user interface in which you can click on the various integration tests that you've got written, and so it's one of my favorite things about the test runner is that. On the left-hand side, you can watch your tests themselves being stepped through. On the right-hand side, you're going to see the browser. So this is what like the user is actually seeing. And as you're developing your tests, sometimes, as with anything in software development, maybe you didn't write something correctly in your code and your test bombs. At every step in your test, you can inspect in the test runner, the values, almost like you're using Xdebug in a PHP app, and Cypress will output them to the console in the browser. So if you want to know what the value of that variable is at that point in the test execution, it'll output it for you in the console. So that's it's really helpful in terms of writing and developing your tests. to be able to, it basically debug your JavaScript.
Now, is
Okay.
the test runner necessary in like a CI/CD process in order to run your Cypress tests, or is it more of just a like a local kind of debugging tool for your tests?
That's more of a local debugging tool.
Got it.
Yeah, for CI, it's obviously there's nobody that's going to be looking at the screen
Mhm.
and watching it in the same way. So no, that's for your local development.
Awesome. Very cool. So, can you tell us a little bit more about fixtures in Cypress? This other term, sort of how they're defined and how they're used within the test framework.
Sure. So fixtures are it's sets of data that can be loaded from a file. So in your test development, you may have a lot of different tests that require the same data. So maybe you have these 5 users and you need to test, things related to those 5 users. If you included creating those users through in all of your different tests, it increases the probability that you'll fat finger something and make a typo, and your test accuracy will diminish. So one of the best reasons to use a fixture is that your data is not going to change, but you can have all different tests that are pulling from the exact same pile of information, and it'll always be the same. So that's really useful. It's also useful in terms of information security. So it may be that you're testing, in the example that I gave at DrupalCon, at Drupal Camp, you have King Arthur giving his answers to the 3 questions. So that's it was kind of fun to use that, but like consider the possibility that you have some sensitive information that you need to test. You don't want to get that into your version control system. So just like you can have a settings.php file in a Drupal production environment, and that settings.php contains sensitive information, it's not in your repository. Similarly, you can have your fixture data live in certain environments, but not live in your repository. So you're keeping things clean and safe that way as well.
I imagine it
So,
also could be used. I imagine it could also be useful in sort of a multi-developer environment to sort of pass around some fixtures if you're not all working from the same central Cypress installation, I suppose. But pass around some fixtures and say, hey, use this as you're adding, part B to my part A to make sure that we're working from the same data.
Exactly. Right. And then so you can identify a fixture for Cypress. And by the way, Cypress is intelligent enough to be able to load fixture data from many different file types. So you can have your XML and your JSON and your text files and CSV and so on.
Oh, nice.
So it's really handy. So whatever's easiest for you in terms of providing your fixture data, you don't have to teach Cypress how to parse that. And then so you can say, go load my fixture, and then for each element in the fixture, rip through this set of tests. So loops are super easy that way. You can it's very efficient, and it's actually kind of fun to watch when it's running.
So early on in the question answering process, it sounded like fixtures were kind of like synonymous to functions, but later on in the answer, it sounds like fixtures are more just data that can be included in anybody's function. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Fixtures provide data that we can use in our testing.
Got it. So it's a data set. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that data is only going to interact with the database if you do something like submit it to a form or something, right? It's not like data that you're using to pre-fill. I guess one of my questions are, if you have like a complex data set that needs to be a data structure that needs to be set up before you can test something,
Mm-hmm.
can you use a fixture to populate that?
Oh, sure.
Or
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. For example, you can say, create these, 50 users, or whatever the story might be.
Okay.
So yeah, you can take fixture data and a real simple use case is enter it into the form and tell me what the results of the form are. But you can also, you can create entities. You can, add content. You can do all sorts of things.
Okay.
I
So
suppose
yeah.
suppose that let me know if this is right, but sort of the difference between the fixture and when you say create 50 users, the difference between doing that in a test that you're running and doing that in a fixture is by doing it in a fixture, you now have at that set of 50 users, and any future test that needs to run against some number of users doesn't have to separately create them. It already has them there. The data is already accessible. The tests can now run against what's present in the 50 users that the fixture has provided, assuming all those tests use that fixture.
Right, exactly. And it's not going to vary. It's,
Mhm.
it's always going to be using a consistent set of entities that you've created or users or whatever it is, because that's all derived from the fixture. And every time you use that fixture data, the results are going to be the same.
Yeah, one thing that like one place I went to in my head was like testing like pass fails on form submissions, right? So you could have in your fixture, you could have like this is good data, bad data, data, bad data variations, and then be able to repeat those tests again and again to say like, okay, well, all of our tests pass as they should, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I just thought of something that can sometimes be difficult to test. Is there any integration with email clients? Like if you want to test like a password reset flow, is that something that Cypress can handle? Can it like intercept an email from your system and click a link, or is that like out of scope? I mean, that typically is out of scope for most testing environments like this. But
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Right. Let's see. So the kinds of things that, remember, Cypress is going to test things that are going to run in the browser. What I wouldn't try to do with Cypress is like in my browser now go open my email web app and look for the email, right? But when I create a new user and Drupal will quite often send this email that we want to know about. Did it test? Did it send the email? What we can do in our Drupal browser is we can go and look at our database logs, and we can look for a database log entry saying, emailed such and such, a user. So that's how I would test things like that.
I did just a quick little Google here because you mentioned so many other projects having potential integrations, and it looks like there's another service called MailSlurp, which is all oriented around a little bit of a crude name, which is all oriented around handling email, and they have a Cypress.js extension, a package that the example they give right here is exactly this, using a confirmation email for a sign up process. So
fantastic.
Yeah, that was going to be my question. Was like, could you have it go look at like MailHog, for example? Like you wouldn't want it to load up your Gmail, but maybe like if you had MailHog running locally, you could say, hey, go look at MailHog. And if this email comes in, like consider this passed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Got a couple of questions about testing. Again, these are pretty standard features. I assume Cypress has it, but it's helpful for our listeners to know. Can you group test together by category or something?
Yeah. So when I write my tests, I will group tests together, that are similar or that are related to similar functionality. So you can, when you build a test file, you can wrap all kinds of different assertions within the one file. So all the setting up that you need to do and so on. And then you make an assertion and move on to the next thing. So I like to group my tests by sort of what they're related to within an individual integration file.
Okay, and can you group them by more than one thing, or is it one-to-one? So if you have something that if you have a routine that needs to run for many tests, can you just tag it with all those different groups?
I mean, I'm not sure what you're asking, but it sounds like a really good use case for a custom command. So
Okay.
you can extend Cypress's language like to do almost anything you would like. So if there's something that you're going to need to do a lot in a lot of different contexts or tests, I would consider the possibility of defining custom commands around that, and then
Hmm.
simply, in all your different tests, just pass the data into those custom commands that they're going to need.
So that sounds like it's going to be the answer to my question, but I'm going to ask it anyway just to see if there's a different answer. Test order and dependencies, can you kind of set that in Cypress? So for example, if I said, hey, tests 1, 2, 3, and 4 have to run and pass before 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 can run, is that something that you can do? Or like test A has to pass before test B can run?
If there were dependencies like that, I'd use conditional logic in my tests themselves, or define them sequentially in the way that's necessary. And then you can also write a test out of sequence and assert that it fails. So that's how I would do it. I would just use conditional logic and proper sequencing.
Now, can you run a test while doing another test? So like if I have a test running, can I say like this test has to call out to another test, run that, and then based on the output or the response from that test, like do something else?
Within a test, the way I think of an answer to your question is I would make use of custom commands.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's probably how I would accomplish what you're trying to describe there.
Interesting.
Changing gears just a little bit, I think it would be interesting to talk just briefly about sort of security in maybe two different contexts. So firstly, the concept of, this is probably off book and not something you would do compared to using a dedicated sort of pen test tool, but have you thought about writing sort of front-end security validation tests? I guess that's sort of what you talked about when you gave the permissions example before. Making sure you haven't made permissions wrong. And then the separate question to that, are there any considerations with how you sort of set up the Cypress testing framework with permissions you might need to give it that you need to be careful of so you're not accidentally pushing a Cypress user with admin to prod and that kind of stuff?
That's interesting. Let's see. So as far as using Cypress to test for security, I think the permission-based thing is a great example of how you can do that. And this user should and should not be able to, have these, try creating a node and get a 403 page and so on.
It wouldn't be traditional security testing in a sort of penetration testing or vulnerability scanning form, but it would give you that like check for misconfiguration, check for this role that I defined hasn't accidentally gained a power it's not supposed to have.
I imagine though you could probably use a fixture, right, and have like a JavaScript string in there or something, and then try to submit that into like a body field or into like to do like a
See if your text formats are protected or sanitized.
Yeah. Did I make sure like am I opening this up to like some sort of cross-site scripting or something like that?
Right, exactly, and you can have Cypress, pop open the source part of what you see is what you get editor, the CK editor, and type in HTML that maybe it shouldn't be typing in. So there's a lot of possibility that way.
So here's a question that I literally just hit me like a ton of bricks. Are you using Cypress to test the Drupal backend as well as the front end?
Do you mean the admin UI by backend? Or
yes. Sorry. Yes, I do. Thank you, Tim.
Let's see. So you certainly can. I haven't used Cypress for any backend UI testing, but absolutely. So again, it simulates a real user experience. So for example, if you need to load an admin form or try to load an admin form and see if this user can or cannot do it, or get into the back end or access information or create users that they shouldn't be able to create. All of that is really native to Cypress, because Cypress it simulates an actual user experience. So you can log in as a non-privileged user and then try to visit the page /admin config, and determine and look for the 403 error there and so on.
Very cool. Well, thank you for joining us. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you should let our listeners know?
Yeah, sure. We will put a link in the notes for this episode to the talk that I gave at Drupal Camp, Colorado. There's going to be a link to the repository that I have for my little project that I use for that talk, and so that has some custom code that you might find useful. And also, I strongly recommend that you take a look at Drupal.org's Cypress module, because it also has some really handy custom commands.
Awesome. Well, Jordan, thank you again for joining us. Cypress has really been gaining steam over the last couple of years. We talked about it briefly with Chris last year, I think. And I've only been hearing good things. So I'm going to have to check it out more fully myself.
Great. Well, thanks for having me.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's Book Corner, sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the button in the sidebar that says Become a Patron.
And if you're going to be at DrupalCon Prague, you can come by and say hello to me as a guest host. I'll be recording the evening of DrupalCon Prague week with this wonderful team. It's September 20th to 23rd. So if you're over in Europe, I hope you'll join us.
Jordan, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what would be the best way?
Send me an email at jordan@attenddesigngroup.com. So that's JORDAN at Aten, designgroup.com.
Awesome. And Tim, if our listeners want to get in touch with you?
You can find me on Drupal.org on the staff page. tim@association.drupal.org is my email, and Hestenet just about everywhere on the internet.
And how about you, John?
I am John Picozzi on all the major social networks and Drupal.org, and you can find out more about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
See you guys next week.
Cheers, everyone.